Hello lovely friends worldwide. Tonight, we're stepping into a different era, not one of battles and conquests, but of forgotten corners and curious lives. A place where history doesn't shout, but whispers, softly enough for you to close your eyes and let it carry you away. We're going back to the Middle Ages, to castles wrapped in mist, to candlelit halls where shadows dance on ancient stone walls, and to kings who ruled not always with wisdom, but often with, well, let's say, peculiar charm. You might expect stories of tyrants and monsters, but that's not quite what we'll find here. Instead, tonight's journey is about those rulers who stood out not for their greatness, but for their strangeness. The ones who made history scratch its head and quietly ask, how did they end up on a throne? So, if you're ready, if you've found a comfortable spot and your body feels heavy with calm, then let's begin. Before we do, though, if you feel like it, take a gentle moment to like this video, subscribe to Bedtime Historia, and maybe even leave a comment telling me where you are right now and what time it is in your part of the world, if it feels right, of course. Now, dim the lights. Turn off any distractions, settle into your pillow, and let the day go, like leaves falling from a tree, one by one, until all that's left is stillness. And as the past begins to stir, let yourself listen deeply. Part 1, The Beginning, A Kingdom of Quirks. Let's begin our journey in a time when the world moved at a different pace, when the rhythm of life was set not by clocks or calendars, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the tolling of church bells, and the slow turning of seasons. This is the Middle Ages, a time often remembered for its battles, its knights, its castles and crowns, but also a time filled with quiet corners, forgotten lives, and rulers who, well, didn't always fit the image of a king you might imagine. In this world of stone towers and candlelit halls, we find ourselves not among the great conquerors or wise sovereigns, but among those whose stories are less often told, the ones history remembers not for their strength or brilliance, but for their strangeness. Their quirks. Their unexpected ways of seeing the world. And as we step into this world together, let your thoughts settle like dust in an old library, soft, gentle, undisturbed. There is no rush here. No urgency. Just the slow unfolding of time and the soft hush of history speaking to you from across the centuries. Imagine now a kingdom bathed in morning light, where the air carries the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The village wakes slowly, roosters call, doors creak open, and the first footsteps of the day echo on cobblestone paths. Farmers walk toward their fields, wrapped in cloaks against the early chill, while children peer out from behind wooden shutters, watching the world come alive. Above them all stands the castle, solid, silent, ancient, its high towers reaching toward the sky like fingers stretching toward the stars. Inside, the court stirs quietly, servants moving with practiced grace, candles flickering in heavy iron chandeliers, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a lute being plucked softly by unseen hands. But today, we are not looking up at banners fluttering atop turrets or marveling at the grandeur of royal feasts. Instead, we look closer at the people who wore the crowns, who sat upon the thrones, and sometimes forgot what they were doing there. Because history is full of kings who led armies, shaped nations, and changed the course of the world. But tonight, we gather around the stories of those who did none of those things, not because they lacked power, but because they lacked convention. Some were brilliant minds lost in dreams. Others were gentle souls unprepared for the weight of rule. And some, well, they simply saw the world in a way that made everyone else wonder if they had missed something. There is a strange comfort in knowing that even in times so distant, so different from our own, there were still people who didn't quite fit. Who tried their best, failed quietly, and left behind stories that remind us it's okay to be a little odd, a little out of place, a little human. So as we begin this journey, picture yourself walking through the corridors of one such kingdom, not with a sword or a scroll, but with curiosity, with kindness, with the willingness to listen to those who perhaps weren't meant to rule, but who ruled nonetheless. Let's start with a king whose story begins not with war drums or coronations, but with silence, with solitude, with a man who, on many days, forgot he was even a king. His name was Charles VI of France, known to history not for his conquests or wisdom, but for something far more unusual. He believed he was a stranger in his own body, a ghost trapped in flesh, and at times, even a wild animal. Yes, you heard that right, a king who thought he was a stag. Now, before you laugh or yawn, let me tell you how that came to be. Charles was born into a world of privilege, raised in the golden glow of royal halls, surrounded by advisors and tutors who taught him the duties of a king. He was handsome, charming, and at first, seemed destined to rule wisely. But then, one autumn evening in 1392, everything changed. While riding through a forest with his entourage, Charles was startled by a sudden scream. A madman leapt from the bushes, shouting warnings of doom. The shock sent the young king into a violent frenzy. He attacked his own men, swinging wildly, screaming that traitors were everywhere. From that moment on, his mind began to slip. He would wander the palace barefoot, refusing to eat, convinced he was made of glass and could shatter at any moment. He refused to bathe, fearing he would disappear if he touched water. At times, he spoke only in whispers, afraid that his voice would betray him to enemies he could not see. But perhaps most curiously of all, he believed he was a stag. He forbade anyone in court from eating venison, claiming it was too cruel. He decorated his clothing with antlers and ran through the halls, imitating the movements of a deer. His attendants watched helplessly as he pawed at the ground, snorted into the cold air, and stared blankly into mirrors, wondering if he would one day vanish entirely. And yet, despite all this, life continued. Outside the palace walls, the people of Paris went about their days, merchants opened their stalls, blacksmiths hammered metal into shape, and mothers rocked their children to sleep beneath patchwork quilts. They whispered about their strange king, yes, but they did not revolt. They did not abandon their lives. They simply carried on, as people do, even when the world feels a little off-kilter. Inside the palace, the nobles held meetings without him. Decisions were made in his name, though he rarely understood them. Some took advantage of his condition, others tried to protect him. But through it all, Charles remained, a man caught between reality and illusion, a king who lived in a world only he could truly see. And perhaps, in a way, that makes his story all the more human. Because haven't we all had moments like that? When the world felt just a little too loud, or too confusing, or too much. When we wanted to escape, not into another place, but into another self? Charles never conquered lands, never signed treaties, never won battles. But he lived a life unlike any other, and in doing so, he left behind a story that reminds us that not every king needs to be great to be remembered. So as we sit here, under the quiet hum of night, perhaps we can imagine what it must have been like to walk beside him through those candlelit halls, to hear the echo of his footsteps, to watch him pause and stare at his reflection, searching for answers no one else could give. And as your breath slows, and your thoughts grow softer, maybe you'll find yourself thinking, not of battles or thrones, but of a man who once believed he was a stag, and how even in the pages of history, there is space for someone different. We've just met Charles VI, the king who believed he was a stag, but this is only the first of many stories we'll share tonight, each one a quiet window into the past, each one a reminder that even those who wear crowns can feel lost, uncertain, and misunderstood. So let's take a deep breath together, slow, steady, and move forward, gently, into the next chapter of our journey. Imagine now a different kingdom, not in France, but in England. It is the late 1400s, and the land is recovering from years of civil strife. Wars have drained the treasury, families have been torn apart, and the people long for peace. And yet, the man who sits on the throne is not a warrior, nor a ruler hardened by battle. He is not even particularly interested in ruling at all. His name is Henry VI. To many historians, he was weak. To others, he was kind, perhaps too kind for the brutal world he lived in. Henry was a man of peace in a time of war, a scholar in a court of soldiers, and above all, a dreamer who preferred books to swords, gardens to battlegrounds. He founded Eton College, gave generously to religious institutions, and spent hours wandering the halls of his palaces, pausing to admire the architecture, the stained glass, the quiet beauty of a world that rarely stayed quiet for long. But while he dreamed, others acted. His wife, Margaret of Anjou, became the true force behind the throne, fighting fiercely to defend their claims and protect their son. Meanwhile, rival factions gathered, whispering in darkened rooms, waiting for the right moment to strike. And yet, Henry remained calm, serene, almost untouched by the chaos around him. He would wake early, say his prayers, and spend the morning reading poetry or sketching plans for new chapels. He loved flowers, especially roses, and would often be seen kneeling in the palace gardens, hands covered in soil, eyes closed in contentment. One could almost forget he was a king. And perhaps that was the problem. For in a world where power was measured in armies and alliances, Henry's gentleness was seen not as a virtue, but as a weakness. He was captured, deposed, imprisoned, and yet, even in captivity, he remained peaceful. He asked for nothing but a Bible, a bit of bread, and a quiet place to pray. History may remember him as a failure, but perhaps that depends on what you believe success looks like. Did he fail because he did not win wars? Or did he succeed in living exactly as he wished, a life of quiet contemplation, of simple joys, of faith and love for the small things? Maybe the real tragedy wasn't that he lost his crown, but that the world never gave him a chance to be who he truly was. And isn't that something we all understand? How often do we feel like we don't belong in the roles we're given? How often do we wish for a life that doesn't match what others expect of us? Henry's story is not one of conquest or glory, but of a man who tried to live gently in a harsh world, and for that alone, he deserves to be remembered. So as we leave him now, sitting beneath a tree in the garden of memory, let's carry with us the lesson he teaches us, that not every leader has to be strong, not every soul has to fight, and that sometimes, the kindest thing a person can do is simply stay gentle. As you lie here, wherever you are, perhaps you can imagine the wind rustling through the branches of that same tree, carrying his story away into the night. And perhaps, just perhaps, it will follow you into your dreams. Part 2, The King Who Did Housework, John Balliol of Scotland. Let's walk together now into another corner of medieval history, not one filled with grand battles or sweeping reforms, but a quieter chapter, one where the king himself might have been found doing something quite unexpected, washing dishes. Yes, you heard that right, there was once a king who did housework. His name was John Balliol, and his story is unlike most others in the long line of monarchs who ruled over Scotland. Now, if you're picturing him as a tyrant or a conqueror, let's gently set that image aside. John was neither feared nor revered during his lifetime. He wasn't known for leading armies across borders or forging mighty alliances. Instead, he was known, perhaps more than anything else, for being ordinary. And in a world where kings were expected to be larger than life, that was a difficult place to be. John was born into nobility, yes, a powerful family with deep roots in both England and Scotland. But when he came to power, he found himself caught in a web far beyond his control, a web spun by ambition, politics, and the looming shadow of one of the most formidable rulers of the time. Edward I of England. You see, after the death of Margaret, the Maid of Norway, the rightful heir to the Scottish throne, a succession crisis erupted. There was no clear successor, and so a competition began. No fewer than 13 claimants stepped forward, each hoping to be chosen as the next ruler of Scotland. John Balliol was one of them. He had a strong legal case, backed by English law and tradition, and ultimately, he was selected, not because he was the strongest or the most charismatic, but because the process favored him. But that choice would come at a cost. Because while John may have worn the crown, it was soon made clear that he would not wear it freely. Edward I, the English king, saw this moment not as the beginning of a new Scottish reign, but as an opportunity, an opening to extend his influence north of the border. And so, he treated John not as a sovereign equal, but as a vassal, a subject, rather than a king. John was summoned to England, forced to answer for decisions he barely got to make. He was asked to send troops to fight in Edward's wars, wars he had no stake in, and which only weakened his own kingdom. And slowly, steadily, he lost the trust of his people. They saw him not as their protector, but as a puppet, a man who sat on the throne, but who never truly ruled. And so, under pressure from within Scotland and manipulation from outside, John's reign became a quiet storm, one without thunder, but full of tension all the same. Eventually, rebellion brewed. His nobles turned against him. And when war broke out between England and Scotland, he found himself standing on uncertain ground, torn between loyalty to the king who had placed him on the throne, and the land whose name he carried. But war was never his strength. Unlike other kings who rode into battle with banners high and swords drawn, John struggled to rally support. His army was weak. His allies were few. And before long, he was captured, not in glory, but in defeat. He was taken to England, stripped of his royal insignia, and forced to surrender his throne publicly, a humiliating ceremony meant not just to remove him from power, but to erase any notion that he had ever held it. He was imprisoned for a time, then released, no longer a king, no longer a ruler, no longer even a figure of consequence. And yet, his story did not end there. Because what happened after his fall from power is perhaps the most surprising part of all. After years of imprisonment and political exile, John eventually retired to a quiet life in Normandy. There, far away from the noise of court and conflict, he lived out his remaining years, not as a monarch, but as a man. And here, in this final chapter of his life, we find something rare and beautiful, a king who, once freed from expectation, simply lived. He walked through gardens, tended to small chores, read books, and perhaps for the first time in years, breathed without fear. There are accounts, gentle, almost poetic, that describe him preparing meals, cleaning his home, caring for his belongings with the same care one might give to a cherished memory. Imagine that, a former king, wearing simple clothes, hands stained with ink and dust, folding linens, lighting candles, humming softly in the stillness of evening. There was no fanfare, no herald announcing his presence, no guard standing watch. Just a quiet man, living quietly. And perhaps, in some ways, that was the freest he had ever been. Because power can be heavy, not just in what it demands, but in what it takes away. It can take your privacy, your peace, your ability to simply exist without scrutiny. And so, when John finally laid down the weight of kingship, he found something many rulers never do, a return to simplicity. Not everyone gets that chance. Some cling to power until the very end, unwilling or unable to let go. Others lose everything and are never given the space to rebuild. But John, he was offered a second life, modest though it was, and he embraced it with grace. So as you listen to this story tonight, wherever you are, whatever your day has held, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking beside him, not through castles or courts, but through the soft light of an autumn afternoon, where the wind carries the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. Perhaps you can picture the two of you sitting by a fire, sipping warm tea, watching the flames dance as the world outside grows still. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing a person can do is simply live gently. We've followed John Balliol from the heights of power to the quiet corners of obscurity, and perhaps along the way, we've discovered something about what it means to be free. Because freedom doesn't always look the way we expect. For some, it comes with victory and triumph. For others, it arrives quietly, not with a coronation, but with the simple act of choosing how to spend one's final days. And for John, it came in the form of a broom, a kettle, and the gentle hush of morning light filtering through a small window. Now, imagine with me another piece of his life, not in the halls of power, but in the rhythms of everyday existence. Morning arrived slowly in his little home in Normandy. The sun rose without urgency, casting a golden glow over the stone walls and wooden beams. Birds chirped from nearby trees, their songs drifting in through open windows. And somewhere not too far off, the faint sound of a bell marked the passing of time, steady and unhurried. John would rise early, as he always had, not out of duty, but out of habit. He would dress simply, wrap himself in a woolen shawl against the cool air, and begin his day with a cup of warm herbal tea, brewed with herbs he grew himself. He liked tending to the garden, planting herbs, pruning vines, watching things grow. It reminded him that not everything had to be loud or dramatic to be meaningful. Some beauty came quietly, leaf by leaf, bloom by bloom. He would walk barefoot on the cool stone floor, enjoying the feel of the earth beneath his feet. He would sweep the hearth, light a small fire, and hum a tune that reminded him of his childhood, a melody passed down through generations, now carried softly in the silence of his home. There were no servants to call upon, no advisors to consult, no letters demanding answers. Just the slow unfolding of time, measured not in decrees or declarations, but in the turning of pages, the stirring of soup, the folding of linen. And in that slowness, there was peace. It's easy to forget that peace does not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes in the shape of a clean table, a freshly made bed, a warm meal shared with no one but oneself. And for John, those simple acts became rituals of healing. He had spent much of his life surrounded by voices, nobles arguing, messengers shouting, crowds murmuring. Now, he lived among whispers, the rustling of leaves, the crackling of firewood, the soft ticking of a clock. And he listened. He listened to the wind, to the silence, to the parts of himself he had long forgotten while wearing a crown. In time, he began writing again, not treaties or proclamations, but personal reflections. Letters to no one in particular, filled with thoughts on the changing seasons, the kindness of neighbors, and the strange comfort of routine. He wrote about the sky at dusk, the warmth of sunlight on old stone, the way certain smells could bring back memories clearer than any painting. He wrote about gratitude, not for power or prestige, but for small mercies, a dry roof, a warm meal, a quiet heart. And as he wrote, he smiled, not often, but enough. Because he had learned that happiness didn't always require a throne. It required presence, awareness, a willingness to find joy in the unremarkable moments that make up most of our lives. So as you lie here tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself stepping into that same quiet space, not as a king or queen, not as someone burdened with great responsibilities, but simply as someone who is allowed to rest, allowed to slow down, allowed to enjoy the softness of the night, the hush of the world outside, the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Because sometimes, that is the greatest luxury of all. And as the story of John Balliol fades into the quiet of history, let it leave behind not a lesson in power, but in peace. A reminder that you don't need a crown to live with dignity. That you don't need a throne to find purpose. That sometimes, the most meaningful life is the one that goes unnoticed, but is felt deeply, every single day. So close your eyes now, if you'd like. Let the weight of the day slip away. Let the past settle like dust on an old bookshelf. And let yourself drift, gently, safely, into sleep. Part 3, The King Who Loved Cooking, Richard II of England. Let's turn now to another chapter in our quiet journey through history, a story not of war or loss, but of beauty, elegance, and the joy found in the simple act of sharing a meal. Tonight, we walk into the candlelit halls of England during the late 14th century, a time when chivalry was still held dear, when feasts were grand affairs filled with music and poetry, and when one young king ruled not with brute strength, but with a deep appreciation for refinement, ceremony, and fine dining. His name was Richard II, a man who lived not for conquests, but for cuisine, not for battles, but for banquets. Now, if you're imagining a king seated at the head of a long table, surrounded by nobles and servants, sipping wine and tasting exotic dishes brought from distant lands, you wouldn't be far off. But what made Richard truly unique wasn't just his love of food, it was how he saw it. To him, a meal was more than nourishment. It was an art form, a carefully orchestrated experience that touched every sense, the warmth of candlelight on polished silver, the soft hum of musicians playing in the background, the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, the delicate flavors dancing on the tongue, and the gentle clink of goblets raised in quiet celebration. He understood something many rulers did not, that comfort could come not only from power or wealth, but from care. And so, he poured his soul into the details. He made sure the tables were set with the finest linens, the cutlery gleamed under torchlight, and the meals were prepared with precision and pride. He even commissioned one of the first known English cookbooks, Unwind, a collection of recipes and techniques that would influence royal kitchens for generations. Imagine that, a king writing about cooking. It may seem unusual to us now, but in a world where most rulers concerned themselves with military campaigns and political alliances, Richard stood apart. He was not interested in leading armies across borders. He was interested in creating spaces where people could gather, relax, and feel seen. Of course, not everyone appreciated this side of him. Some called him weak. Others said he cared too much about appearances and not enough about governance. And yet, those who dined at his table remembered something different. They remembered kindness, generosity, and a rare kind of hospitality that made even the humblest guest feel like royalty. Let me tell you a little more about the man behind the feast. Richard came to the throne as a boy, only 10 years old when he was crowned King of England. That is very young to carry such weight, and perhaps that explains why he never truly escaped the need for control, for order, for beauty in a world that often felt chaotic. He grew up surrounded by advisors, many of whom tried to shape his reign according to their own ambitions. But while others plotted wars and treaties, Richard turned inward, toward art, toward ceremony, toward the small joys that gave life its texture. He built gardens filled with fragrant flowers and shaded paths. He filled his palaces with tapestries depicting scenes of peace rather than battle. He listened to poets and musicians, and he believed deeply in the idea that a kingdom should not only be strong, but also beautiful. And nowhere was that belief more evident than in his kitchens. Because for Richard, feeding his guests was not just a duty, it was a way of saying, "You are welcome here." He personally oversaw the preparation of meals, ensuring that everything was perfect, from the color of the sauces to the arrangement of fruits on the platter. He hired skilled cooks and trained them in new techniques, encouraging them to experiment with spices and presentation. He even had rules for how food should be served, not hurriedly, not carelessly, but with grace and attention. Every dish was meant to be savored, every flavor balanced, every bite a reminder that life, even in difficult times, could still offer moments of pleasure. And isn't that something we all long for? A warm meal shared with someone you care about. The smell of fresh bread baking in the oven. The sound of laughter around a table. These are the things that make life feel full, not necessarily grand, but meaningful. So as you lie here tonight, wherever you are, let yourself imagine being seated at one of Richard's tables, not as a noble or a courtier, but simply as someone who has been invited to rest, to enjoy, to be present. Picture the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows on the walls. Picture the rich aroma of roasted pheasant, the sweet tang of mulled wine, the gentle rustle of linen napkins unfolded in your lap. Hear the soft strumming of a lute in the background, the quiet murmur of conversation, the occasional clink of glasses as people raise them in silent toast. There is no rush here. No pressure. Just the slow unfolding of a moment, like the turning of a page in a favorite book. We've walked through the kitchens of Richard II's palace together, smelled the spices, heard the crackling fire, seen the careful hands of cooks preparing dishes with devotion. But there is more to his story, a quieter part, one that speaks not of feasts and banquets, but of solitude and silence. Because while Richard loved to feed others, he himself often ate alone. Even in the midst of grandeur, there were moments when he must have felt the weight of his crown, not as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of his isolation. He was a king, yes, but also a child who had grown up too quickly, a ruler who never quite found his place among those who wanted him to be something else. And so, while his guests enjoyed the warmth of company and laughter, he often retreated into the quiet corners of his mind, reading by candlelight, writing notes in the margins of books, or simply watching the rain fall outside his window. There were nights when he wandered the corridors of his palace, barefoot, dressed in plain robes, seeking the kind of peace that could not be bought or ordered. He would pause in front of mirrors, studying his reflection, wondering if the face looking back was truly his own. At times, he seemed almost fragile, not because he lacked intelligence or talent, but because he felt things deeply, and the world rarely rewards sensitivity in those who lead. Still, he remained devoted to the art of living well, even when his life became uncertain. As the years passed, tensions in the kingdom grew. Some nobles questioned his authority. Others sought to remove him from power. And though he tried to hold onto his vision of a peaceful, elegant rule, the tides began to shift against him. In the end, he lost his throne, not in battle, but through betrayal. He was captured, stripped of his titles, and imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, far from the grand halls he once ruled, far from the kitchens where he had once found solace. There, in a cold room with stone walls and narrow windows, he spent his final days. And yet, even in exile, he asked for only a few things: a Bible, some paper, ink, and a decent meal. He requested that his food be prepared with care, that his wine be warmed before serving, that his table be set properly each day. Even in confinement, he wished to eat with dignity. And perhaps, in doing so, he reminded us that no matter where we are, whether seated at a banquet or confined within four walls, we deserve to be treated with kindness. That even in darkness, we can still seek light. That even in loneliness, we can still find comfort in the smallest of rituals. And so, as we leave Richard now, let's remember him not only as a king who loved cooking, but as a man who understood the quiet power of care. Who knew that a warm plate of food, a clean tablecloth, and a gentle word could do more to heal a heart than any decree or proclamation. And perhaps, in your own life, you've known that too. Maybe you found peace in the act of preparing a meal, in the rhythm of chopping vegetables, in the scent of herbs rising from a pot, and the simple joy of setting a table for someone you care about. Or maybe you found comfort in small routines, making your bed, lighting a candle, pouring a cup of tea, actions that say, without words, I am here. I am taking care of myself. Because that, too, is a kind of royalty. Not one measured in gold or land, but in the ability to live with grace, even when the world feels unkind. So as you lie here tonight, wherever you are, let the story of Richard II settle gently around you, not as a tale of power lost, but of beauty preserved. Let the image of a quiet kitchen, a warm meal, and a candle's glow follow you into sleep. And as your breath slows, and your thoughts grow soft, know that you, too, are allowed to find peace, in whatever way brings you comfort. Close your eyes now, if you'd like. Let the past drift away. Let the present cradle you like a lullaby. And let the night carry you gently into dreams. Part 4, The Lost Prince, Louis XVII of France. Let's begin now with a story that is not often told in the way we usually hear history, not with battles or proclamations, not with triumph or tragedy played out on grand stages, but with silence. A long, soft silence. One filled with waiting. With wondering. With the quiet footsteps of a child who never had the chance to grow up. This is the story of Louis XVII, the Lost Prince of France. It begins in a world of candlelight and velvet curtains, where the air smelled of beeswax candles and polished wood, where chandeliers shimmered like stars trapped inside crystal, and where a little boy once ran barefoot through echoing halls, unaware that his life would one day be remembered more for what was lost than for what was lived. Louis Charles was born into royalty, yes, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, but he was also simply a child. A boy who laughed when he was tickled, who reached for his mother's hand when thunder rolled outside, who learned to read by tracing his fingers over letters inked carefully onto parchment. He was not meant to rule. That role belonged to his older brother. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. His brother died young, leaving Louis as the Dauphin, the heir to a kingdom already trembling beneath the weight of unrest. And then, before he could truly understand what any of it meant, everything changed. The palace doors were locked from the outside. The laughter stopped. The music faded. And the boy who had once played among portraits and mirrors found himself standing alone in a cold room, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and whispers he could not understand. And so began the long silence. Because after that moment, no one really saw him again. Not his mother. Not his father. Not even those who claimed to protect him. He was taken away, not to another palace, not to a school where he might learn how to lead, but to a prison cell beneath the streets of Paris. There, in a place where light came only from cracks between the stones and the dampness clung to the walls like a ghost unwilling to leave, he spent the final years of his short life. No books. No toys. No companions except for his own thoughts and the sound of his own breath. Some say he was taught lessons by a distant tutor who visited briefly each day. Others say he was left entirely alone, forgotten by all but time itself. We do not know exactly what happened to him. But we do know this: he disappeared. And in his place, history left behind questions that still linger today. Did he die quietly in that dark room, unnoticed and unmourned? Or did he somehow survive, slipping away into obscurity, living under another name, watching the world move on without ever revealing who he truly was? No one knows for sure. What we do know is that his story became legend, not because of what he did, but because of what was done to him. Because sometimes, the most haunting stories are not the ones filled with action or drama, but the ones that ask us to sit quietly and imagine what it must have been like, to be small, to be afraid, to wait for someone to come and never hear the door open. So tonight, let's do just that. Let's close our eyes and picture a morning long ago, the kind of morning where the sun rises slowly, stretching across rooftops and cobblestone streets, casting long shadows against stone walls. In a house somewhere far from the city, a woman lights a fire in the hearth, warming her hands as the kettle begins to steam. Outside, chickens peck at the ground, and the wind carries the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. Life moves gently here. Slowly. Peacefully. But deep below the streets of Paris, in a place untouched by morning light, another day begins for the young prince. He wakes on a thin straw mattress, wrapped in a blanket that offers little warmth. His feet are cold. His stomach is empty. And the silence around him is so thick it feels like a heavy curtain drawn tightly around his world. He sits up slowly, rubbing his eyes, blinking against the dim light that barely reaches him from above. He listens, hoping to hear something familiar, something comforting, something that will remind him that he is not alone. But there is nothing. Only the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. Only the echo of his own movements bouncing softly off the stone walls. He has grown used to this. Not in the way of someone who accepts their situation with peace, but in the way of someone who has no choice but to endure it. And yet, even in this quiet darkness, he finds ways to remember. He remembers the gardens of Versailles, where he chased butterflies and picked flowers for his mother. He remembers the scent of lavender that always seemed to follow her, the way she smiled when he mispronounced his lessons, the soft touch of her hand against his forehead when he was sick. He remembers his father, tall and gentle, who tried to explain things in a way he could understand, even when the world was changing too quickly for anyone to keep up. He remembers the horses, the carriages, the laughter that echoed through marble halls. He remembers feeling safe. And now, he waits. He waits for someone to come. For someone to unlock the door. For someone to tell him that it is time to go home. But days pass. Then weeks. Then months. And still, no one comes. Sometimes, he talks to himself, just to hear a voice. Sometimes he hums a tune he once heard his governess sing. Sometimes he presses his ear against the wall, trying to catch the faintest sound of life beyond the prison walls. And sometimes he closes his eyes and pretends he is somewhere else. Somewhere warm. Somewhere bright. Somewhere where no one locks doors and no one forgets names. Maybe you've had moments like that too, moments when the world felt too big, or too loud, or too fast. When you wished for a place to hide, to rest, to feel safe again. Lewis knew that longing well. And perhaps that is why his story continues to find its way into hearts even today, not because he ruled a kingdom, but because he reminds us of what it means to be human. To hope. To wonder. To dream, even when the world seems determined to keep you in the dark. So as we walk together through this quiet chapter of history, let yourself slow down. Let your breath find its rhythm again. Let the weight of the day settle softly around you, like dust in an old book. Because tonight, we are not chasing excitement or adventure. We are simply remembering. Remembering a boy who once lived. A boy who once dreamed. A boy who, even now, waits patiently in the pages of history, not for glory, not for power, but for someone to sit beside him, even just for a little while. If you're still with me tonight, still listening in the hush of evening, then thank you for letting this quiet story find a place in your heart, for allowing history to become a lullaby, and for giving yourself permission to rest. We left young Louis in his small prison room beneath the streets of Paris, alone, waiting, dreaming of gardens he could no longer walk through, voices he could no longer hear, and a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. But even in that silence, there were moments of warmth, small, fleeting, but real. Sometimes, the sound of children playing outside reached him through the stone walls, muffled but unmistakable. He would press his ear to the cold surface and listen, imagining himself among them, running barefoot across cobblestones warmed by afternoon sun, laughing without worry. Other times, when the wind blew just right, he could catch the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery or the faint aroma of flowers brought in by market vendors passing on the street above. These were not luxuries, not grand feasts or royal banquets, but they reminded him that the world still turned, that life continued beyond the darkness of his cell. And perhaps most importantly, they reminded him that he was still alive. Because sometimes, simply being aware of the world around us, even if we cannot touch it, is enough to keep hope alive. There are records, though sparse, that tell of how he lived during those years. Some say he was often pale, thin, and tired, not surprising, given the conditions of his imprisonment. Others claim he remained curious, asking questions whenever someone entered his room, trying to understand what had become of his family, his home, his name. He was not cruelly treated, at least not in the way one might expect. There was no torture, no beatings, only isolation. A slow erosion of time, of memory, of identity itself. And in a way, that may have been the cruelest punishment of all. Because while the world moved forward, debating politics and power, Louis remained frozen in place, untouched by change, unacknowledged by those who once knew him. His mother had been executed. His father before her. His sister, Marie-Therese, was eventually released, but she never saw him again. And so, he became a ghost long before he was gone. No one knows exactly when he died. Some say it was in the summer of 1795, when the heat pressed down on Paris like a heavy blanket and the city buzzed with news of war and revolution. Others believe it was earlier, a quiet slipping away, unnoticed by anyone except the guards who came to check on him each morning. What we do know is this: when they finally opened the door to his cell, they found only an empty room. No body. No belongings. Just destined silence. And so began the mystery that has lasted for centuries. Did he truly die there, forgotten and alone? Or did he escape, taken away in secret, hidden among the common folk, living out his days under another name, watching the world move on without ever revealing who he really was? There have been many claimants over the years, men who said they were the lost prince, who spoke of Versailles with tears in their eyes, who remembered details only someone close to the royal family could have known. But none could prove it. And perhaps that's part of why his story endures, because it leaves room for wonder. For possibility. For the idea that somewhere, somehow, a little boy did survive, and that he found peace in a simple life far away from palaces and politics. So tonight, as you lie here wherever you are, wrapped in blankets, surrounded by soft pillows, or simply resting in the quiet hush of night, let yourself imagine a different ending. Imagine a man walking through a village at dusk, his face withered by time but gentle with kindness. He speaks softly to the townspeople, helps mend fences, tends to a garden filled with lavender and roses. Children run past him, calling him uncle or friend. He smiles, watching them go, his heart full with memories that only he can see. He does not wear a crown. He does not sit on a throne. But he is free. And maybe, just maybe, that is the happiest ending any of us can ask for. Because freedom does not always come with fanfare. Sometimes, it comes quietly, in the form of a warm meal, a familiar voice, or the simple joy of waking up each morning knowing you belong to yourself. Lewis may not have had much of a childhood. He may not have had the chance to grow into the man he was meant to be. But if there is one thing we can give him now, after all these years, it is the gift of imagination. Let us imagine him happy. Let us imagine him safe. Let us imagine him loved. Because every child deserves that. And now, as we leave this chapter behind, let the silence settle around you once more, not the silence of loneliness, but the silence of peace. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a warm blanket, that invites you to close your eyes, to breathe deeply, and to drift gently into sleep. You've been very patient with this story, with its pauses, its questions, its quiet moments. And for that, I thank you. Because sometimes, the best stories aren't the ones that wake us up, but the ones that help us fall asleep. Part 5. The King Who Thought He Was Made of Glass, Charles VI of France. Let's now return once more to the quiet corners of history, to a kingdom where the walls whispered secrets, where candlelight flickered like distant stars, and where one man lived not in fear of war or rebellion, but in fear of himself. This is the story of Charles VI of France, a king who ruled a great nation yet did not always believe he belonged to his own body. His name may already feel familiar, for we met him briefly in the opening chapters of this journey, when we first began exploring the lives of rulers who were remembered not for their strength, but for their strangeness. And tonight, we return to his world, not to judge, not to question, but simply to understand. Because sometimes, the most human stories are not about power or conquest, but about the quiet battles fought behind closed doors, the ones no one else sees. Charles was born into royalty, the son of Charles V, a wise and respected ruler known as Charles the Wise. When his father passed away, young Charles inherited the throne at just 12 years old, with high hopes resting on his shoulders. He was handsome, intelligent, and full of promise. At first, everything seemed to be going well. He married Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman who would later become both his partner and his mystery. He ruled over a kingdom rich in culture and tradition. And though there were tensions within the court, nothing suggested that his life would soon take such an unexpected turn. Then, one autumn evening in 1392, something changed. While riding through a forest with his entourage, Charles was startled by a sudden scream. A madman leapt from the bushes, shouting warnings of doom. The shock sent the young king into a violent frenzy. He attacked his own men, swinging wildly, screaming that traitors were everywhere. From that moment on, his mind began to slip. At first, it was subtle, small moments of confusion, brief lapses in memory. But soon, the changes became undeniable. There were days when he forgot who he was. Days when he refused to eat, believing that someone had poisoned his food. Days when he wandered the palace barefoot, muttering to himself, convinced he was being watched. But perhaps most curiously of all, he believed he was made of glass. Yes, glass. He feared that if he moved too quickly, if he touched water, if someone hugged him too tightly, he would shatter. So he wrapped himself in layers of clothing, careful not to bump into anything. He avoided mirrors, afraid of what he might see. And he often sat very still, eyes wide, listening to the silence around him, as if waiting for the sound of breaking shards. It must have been terrifying, to live inside a body you no longer trusted, to look at your hands and wonder if they were real, to wake up each morning unsure of whether you were still yourself. And yet, despite all this, life continued. Outside the palace walls, the people of Paris went about their days, merchants opened their stalls, blacksmiths hammered metal into shape, and mothers rocked their children to sleep beneath patchwork quilts. They whispered about their strange king, yes, but they did not revolt. They did not abandon their lives. They simply carried on, as people do, even when the world feels a little off-kilter. Inside the palace, the nobles held meetings without him. Decisions were made in his name, though he rarely understood them. Some took advantage of his condition, others tried to protect him. But through it all, Charles remained, a man caught between reality and illusion, a king who lived in a world only he could truly see. And perhaps, in a way, that makes his story all the more human. Because haven't we all had moments like that? When the world felt just a little too loud, or too confusing, or too much. When we wanted to escape, not into another place, but into another self? Charles never conquered lands, never signed treaties, never won battles. But he lived a life unlike any other, and in doing so, he left behind a story that reminds us that not every king needs to be great to be remembered. So as we sit here, under the quiet hum of night, perhaps we can imagine what it must have been like to walk beside him through those candlelit halls, to hear the echo of his footsteps, to watch him pause and stare at his reflection, searching for answers no one else could give. And as your breath slows, and your thoughts grow softer, maybe you'll find yourself thinking, not of battles or thrones, but of a man who once believed he was made of glass, and how even in the pages of history, there is space for someone different. If you've stayed with me this far, still listening in the hush of night, still allowing these quiet stories to settle into your thoughts like dust on an old bookshelf, then thank you. Because tonight's journey has not been one of battles or conquests, but of something far more delicate, a mind unraveling, a soul reaching for meaning, and a man who lived inside a world only he could truly see. We left Charles in his palace, wrapped in layers of fabric, moving carefully through candlelit corridors, believing that even the softest breeze might break him. But let us go deeper now, not just into the strange beliefs that shaped his life, but into the world around him, into the people who watched him fade in and out of reality, into the quiet ways they tried to care for him, even when they did not understand. because no matter how strange his fears became, he was still a king. And those who served him still treated him with respect, even if it was sometimes done from a distance. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, remained by his side for many years, though history remembers her more for what she did after his decline than during it. She dressed him gently, spoke to him softly, and often sat beside him as he stared at nothing in particular, lost in thoughts no one else could follow. There are accounts, gentle, almost poetic, of her reading to him in the evenings, choosing simple stories about forests and rivers, things that brought calm rather than confusion. Sometimes, he would listen quietly. Other times, he would drift off before she finished, his breathing slow and steady, his face finally free of worry. And perhaps that was the greatest gift she gave him, not power, not control, not even clarity, but peace, however fleeting. Outside their chambers, the court continued its routines. Servants moved silently through the halls. Musicians played soft melodies in distant rooms. Nobles whispered behind closed doors, discussing politics and alliances while trying not to disturb the fragile balance of the kingdom. Some were loyal to Charles, hoping he would return to full health. Others saw his condition as weakness, an opportunity to shift power elsewhere. But few, if any, ever treated him with cruelty. Instead, they made space for him. They adjusted their schedules so he would not be startled by loud noises. They avoided sudden movements when he was near. They never argued in front of him, never raised their voices, never questioned his reality aloud. It was not always easy to live alongside someone whose world shifted unpredictably, but they tried. And maybe that is one of the kindest things we can do for someone who feels lost. Not try to pull them back too quickly, not force them into our version of reality, but simply be there. To sit beside them in silence. To offer warmth without pressure. To allow them to exist, even if their existence looks different from ours. That, perhaps, is the heart of Charles's story, not madness, not weakness, but the human need to be seen, even when we cannot fully explain ourselves. So as you lie here tonight, wherever you are, perhaps you can imagine yourself walking through those same quiet halls, not as a king or queen, not as someone burdened with great responsibilities, but simply as someone who is allowed to rest. Allowed to slow down. Allowed to feel whatever needs feeling, without explanation. Because sometimes, that is the greatest luxury of all. Now, picture with me another moment, not in the palace, but outside its walls, where the world continued despite the struggles within. In the countryside beyond Paris, life moved at a different pace. Farmers rose early to tend to their fields. Children chased each other through open meadows. Elderly villagers sat on wooden benches, sipping warm drinks and watching the sky change color with the passing hours. No one there spoke much of the king. They had their own worries, harvests, weather, family matters. But if they heard whispers about Charles, they did not react with fear or mockery. Instead, they listened with curiosity. With sympathy. Because they, too, knew what it meant to feel fragile. To wake up unsure of how the day would unfold. To carry invisible burdens that no one else could see. And so, in their own quiet way, they understood him. Even if only a little. Even if only from afar. And perhaps that is part of why his story remains with us today, not because he ruled a mighty kingdom, but because he reminds us that strength does not always mean being unbreakable. Sometimes, it means surviving even when you feel like glass. And that, dear listener, is no small thing. So as we begin to close this chapter, let your breath slow once more. Let the past settle like dust on an old windowsill. Let the weight of the day slip away. And allow yourself to drift, gently, safely, into sleep. Because even in the pages of history, there is room for dreams. Part 6. The Gentle King Who Loved Poetry, Henry VI of England. Let's walk now into another quiet corner of history, not one filled with battles or ambition, but with poetry, prayer, and the gentle hum of a man who lived more for peace than power. This is the story of Henry VI of England, a king whose heart belonged not to war councils or conquests, but to books, gardens, and the soft rhythm of morning light filtering through stained glass windows. If you are imagining him as a warrior king, armored and commanding, let that image gently fade away. Because Henry was not known for leading armies across battlefields. He was not remembered for grand speeches or sweeping reforms. Instead, he was known, perhaps more than anything else, for being kind. Too kind, some said. In a world where kings were expected to be strong, decisive, and often ruthless, Henry stood out like a candle in a storm, fragile, flickering, but undeniably warm. He was born during a time of great unrest, the long shadow of the 100 Years' War stretching over Europe, the English crown tangled in disputes over land and legitimacy, and the people caught between politics and war. Henry came to power as an infant, crowned king before he could even walk. And so, his early years were shaped not by experience, but by expectation, by advisors who made decisions for him, by nobles who saw him as a symbol rather than a ruler, and by a world that never truly gave him the chance to grow into himself. And yet, even as he grew older, he remained, at heart, a dreamer. A man who found solace in quiet places. A man who preferred reading to ruling. A man who believed deeply in faith, in beauty, in the idea that kindness could shape a kingdom as surely as any sword. Now, imagine with me a morning in the late 15th century, the sun rising slowly over the English countryside, casting golden light over rolling hills and winding rivers. In the distance, bells begin to ring from the towers of a nearby chapel, their sound drifting softly through the crisp morning air. Inside a quiet palace tucked away from the noise of court, Henry sits alone in a small study lined with wooden shelves filled with books. A candle burns beside him, its flame steady against the cool stillness of the room. His hands are wrapped around a worn leather-bound volume, perhaps a collection of prayers, maybe a book of poetry, and he reads slowly, carefully, as if each word carries weight beyond its meaning. There is no rush here. No demands. Just the turning of pages, the soft scratching of ink on parchment as he jots down notes in the margins, the occasional pause to look out the window and watch the sky change color. This was how many of his mornings began, not with strategy meetings or political debates, but with reflection, with reverence, with the simple joy of holding a book and knowing that for a little while, the world could wait. Because for Henry, peace was not weakness, it was strength. It was courage. To choose calm in a time of chaos. To seek understanding when others reached for weapons. To believe in gentleness, even when the world seemed determined to test it. And so, he built not just castles and armies, but something far less visible, spaces for learning, for worship, for quiet thought. He founded Eton College, believing that education should be accessible to all, not just the privileged few. He supported religious institutions, not out of obligation, but because he saw faith as a source of comfort and guidance. And above all, he surrounded himself with beauty, art, music, architecture, things that spoke not only to the mind, but to the soul. His palaces were not filled with war banners or trophies of battle, but with tapestries depicting scenes of nature, of scholars reading beneath trees, of musicians playing soft melodies in candlelit halls. And his gardens, oh, how he loved his gardens. They were filled with roses, lavender, and herbs that filled the air with gentle fragrance. He would often walk among them barefoot, feeling the cool grass beneath his feet, pausing to admire the way sunlight filtered through leaves. Sometimes, he would sit beneath a tree for hours, simply listening to birdsong, to the rustling wind, to the distant hum of life beyond the palace walls. And perhaps in those moments, he felt most like himself. Not a king weighed down by duty. Not a ruler caught in the tides of history. But simply a man who loved the quiet beauty of the world. So as you lie here tonight, wherever you are, let yourself imagine walking alongside him, not through grand halls or royal chambers, but through soft earth and dappled light, where the only thing guiding your steps is the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Because sometimes, the most powerful presence we can offer the world is not force, but stillness. Not control, but care. Not noise, but silence. And in that silence, there is space for peace. If you're still with me tonight, still listening in the hush of evening, still allowing these quiet stories to settle into your thoughts like dust on an old windowsill, then thank you. Because we have been walking together through time, not in search of power or conquest, but in search of something quieter, something more delicate, the heart of a man who ruled not with swords, but with softness. We left Henry sitting beneath a tree in his garden, surrounded by the scent of lavender and the gentle hum of bees drifting from flower to flower. But let us go a little deeper now, not just into the peace he found among nature, but into the world that often failed to understand him. Because while Henry loved poetry, gardens, and prayer, the kingdom around him did not always move at the same gentle pace. England was caught in the throes of political unrest, rival factions pulling at the edges of the crown, disputes over land and legitimacy stretching across generations. And though Henry tried to bring calm, many saw his kindness as weakness. They wanted a king who would fight. But Henry wanted only to heal. He avoided war councils when he could, preferring to send envoys rather than armies. He sought reconciliation instead of revenge. And when battles were fought in his name, he rarely rejoiced, instead retreating to his study, where he would read scripture or write letters filled with quiet hope. There are records, gentle, almost poetic, of how he spent his days during times of conflict. While others prepared for battle, he walked barefoot through the palace corridors, hands folded in prayer. While generals sharpened their blades, he lit candles before painted icons, whispering words of peace into the flickering light. And when messengers arrived bearing news of victories or defeats, he would listen without anger, without celebration, simply nodding, then returning to his books. Some called this passivity. Others called it wisdom. Because strength does not always look the way we expect. Sometimes, it looks like choosing silence over shouting. Choosing compassion over control. Choosing stillness, even when the world is shaking. And perhaps, in a way, that made Henry one of the most human rulers of his time. Because haven't we all known moments like that? When the world expected us to be strong, but all we wanted was to be gentle. When people urged us to speak louder, but our hearts whispered that sometimes the kindest thing is to say nothing at all. Henry knew those moments well. And so, he lived quietly, not in hiding, not in fear, but in faith. Faith that kindness mattered. That beauty had value. That peace was worth pursuing, even if it never fully arrived. Now, picture with me another moment, not in the palace, not in council chambers, but in the small hours of the night, when the castle grew still and the only sound was the occasional creak of wooden beams settling into place. Henry sat alone by candlelight, a quill in hand, ink staining his fingers. Before him lay a blank page, waiting, patient, full of possibility. He did not write decrees or proclamations that night. Instead, he wrote poetry. Not for anyone's approval. Not for history's record. Just for himself. His verses were simple, not grand epics or sweeping declarations, but quiet reflections on the changing seasons, the warmth of sunlight, the way certain smells brought back memories clearer than any painting. He wrote about the sky at dusk, the hush of morning, the way birds seemed to sing just a little softer when the wind was kind. He wrote about gratitude, not for power or prestige, but for small mercies, a dry roof, a warm meal, a quiet heart. And as he wrote, he smiled, not often, but enough. Because he had learned that happiness didn't always require a throne. It required presence. Awareness. A willingness to find joy in the unremarkable moments that make up most of our lives. So as you lie here tonight, perhaps you can imagine yourself stepping into that same quiet space, not as a king or queen, not as someone burdened with great responsibilities, but simply as someone who is allowed to rest. Allowed to slow down. Allowed to enjoy the softness of the night, the hush of the world outside, the gentle rhythm of your own breath. Because sometimes, that is the greatest luxury of all. And as the story of Henry VI fades into the quiet of history, let it leave behind not a lesson in power, but in peace. A reminder that you don't need a crown to live with dignity. That you don't need a throne to find purpose. That sometimes, the most meaningful life is the one that goes unnoticed, but is felt deeply, every single day. So close your eyes now, if you'd like. Let the weight of the day slip away. Let the past settle like dust on an old bookshelf. And let yourself drift, gently, safely, into sleep. Part 7, The Final Reflections, Lessons from the Past. And so we arrive at the final chapter of our quiet journey, not with fanfare or celebration, but with a gentle pause, as if standing at the edge of a forest just before dusk, listening to the last birdsong of the day. We have walked together through time, stepping softly into the lives of kings and princes whose stories do not end in triumph or glory, but in something far more human, uncertainty, longing, and the search for meaning in a world that often misunderstands those who are different. Tonight, we gather all the threads we have followed, the lost prince who vanished into silence, the king who thought he was made of glass, the ruler who found peace in poetry and gardens, the man who cooked for his court like it was an act of love rather than duty. Each of them wore a crown, yet none of them fit the image of what a king should be. And perhaps that is why their stories remain with us today, because they remind us that power does not always mean strength, and greatness is not always measured in battles won or lands conquered. Sometimes, greatness is simply being yourself, even when the world expects you to be someone else. So let us take one last walk together, not through castles or courts, but through the quiet spaces between history and memory, where the past speaks not in loud declarations, but in whispers meant only for those willing to listen. Let's begin by returning to a place we have visited many times over these long hours, a candlelit room, where the air is still and the walls seem to hold the echoes of voices long gone. Here, in this imagined space, we sit together, not as rulers or subjects, not as scholars or students, but simply as people who have listened carefully to the past and allowed its stories to settle gently into our hearts. And now, we ask ourselves a simple question. What did we learn? Not about dates or dynasties, not about wars or treaties, but about life. About the kind of life that unfolds slowly, quietly, sometimes painfully, but always with meaning, if only we choose to see it. Because each of these men, in their own way, showed us something rare and precious. They showed us that it is okay to feel fragile, That it is okay to prefer peace over conflict. That it is okay to find joy in small things, a warm meal, a garden path, the turning of a page. And most importantly, that it is okay to be different. In a world that often demands conformity, these were men who lived outside the lines, who followed paths no one else had walked before them. And though their lives were not always easy, though they were often misunderstood, they left behind something valuable, not riches or empires, but humanity. A reminder that not every story needs to be loud to be meaningful. That not every life must change the world to leave an impression. That sometimes, just being gentle is enough. Now, imagine with me one last evening, not set in any particular time or place, but simply a moment that feels familiar to all of us. The sky has turned deep blue, the stars beginning to appear one by one, like distant lanterns lighting the way into night. Somewhere nearby, a breeze moves through trees, carrying with it the scent of earth after rain. Indoors, a fire burns low in the hearth, casting soft shadows across wooden beams and stone walls. You are wrapped in a blanket, or lying beneath warm sheets, your body heavy with calm, your thoughts drifting like smoke into the dark. There is no rush here. No need to do anything except breathe. And as you listen to these final words, allow yourself to remember, not just the kings we have met, but the feelings they brought with them. The quiet dignity of John Balliol, who found freedom not on a throne, but in the simple act of doing his own dishes. The strange beauty of Charles VI, who lived inside a mind that played tricks on him, yet never stopped searching for meaning. The poetic heart of Henry VI, who believed deeply in kindness, even when the world gave him little reason to. The lost boyhood of Louis XVII, whose story reminds us that some lives are remembered not for what they did, but for what they never got the chance to become. And the gentle soul of Richard II, who understood that care could be shown not just through words or laws, but through the warmth of a shared meal. These were not perfect men, but they were real. And perhaps that is why their stories continue to reach across time, not to teach us how to rule, but how to live. With grace. With patience. With the willingness to be seen, even when we do not fit neatly into the roles others expect of us. So as we close this chapter together, let your breath slow once more. Let your thoughts soften. Let the weight of the day slip away. And allow yourself to rest, knowing that even in the pages of history, there is always space for dreams. If you're still with me tonight, still listening in the hush of evening, still allowing these quiet stories to settle into your thoughts like dust on an old windowsill, then thank you. Because we have reached the final stretch of our journey together, not with a loud ending, but with a gentle one, like the last note of a lullaby fading into silence. We've walked through candlelit halls and forgotten corridors, met kings who ruled in their own strange ways, and followed the quiet echoes of lives that were not always celebrated in their time, but continue to speak to us now. Tonight, let's take a deep breath together, slow, steady, and allow ourselves to reflect just a little longer on what all of this has meant. Because history is often told as a story of battles won and lost, of empires rising and falling, of rulers who changed the world through conquest or command. But sometimes, it is also something else entirely. Sometimes, history is simply about people, trying their best, making mistakes, loving quietly, living differently, and leaving behind only whispers where others left thunder. And isn't that enough? Isn't it enough to be remembered for how you made someone feel? For the kindness you offered when no one was watching? For the way you chose peace, even when the world asked for war? These kings did not always fit the mold of what a ruler should be, and perhaps that is exactly why their stories remain with us. because they remind us that not everyone needs to be strong to matter, that not everyone needs to lead to be remembered, that not everyone needs to conquer to leave a mark. Sometimes, just being human is enough. So as you lie here tonight, wherever you are, let yourself imagine the world they lived in, not through grand battles or sweeping reforms, but through small moments. The sound of rain tapping gently against stone walls. The scent of beeswax candles burning low. The soft rustle of parchment as a king writes poetry by firelight. The quiet laughter of children playing somewhere far away. The slow turning of pages in a book that holds no answers, only questions. And above all, the feeling of being seen. Of being understood. Even if only by the past. Because isn't that what we all long for? To know that we are not alone? That someone, somewhere, whether in the present or across centuries, has felt the same things we do? Fear. Hope. Loneliness. Love. Doubt. Wonder. And the quiet certainty that there is more to life than what can be measured in power or wealth. So tonight, as we come to the end of this chapter, let's sit together in the hush of night, not to say goodbye, but to offer thanks. Thanks to the lost prince who reminded us that childhood can be fragile. Thanks to the king who thought he was made of glass, who taught us that strength doesn't always mean being unbreakable. Thanks to the gentle ruler who loved poetry, who showed us that kindness is its own kind of courage. Thanks to the man who cooked for his court, who believed deeply in care, even when no one seemed to notice. Thanks to the king who did housework, who found freedom not in titles, but in simple routines. Each of them lived differently. Each of them stood apart. And yet, each of them left behind something beautiful, not gold or land, not armies or crowns, but humanity. A reminder that even those who seem out of place still belong. That even those who don't fit the mold still matter. That even those who vanish from history can still be remembered. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our journey together, a quiet ending, like the last page of a book gently closed, or the final note of a lullaby drifting into the night. We have walked through candlelit halls and forgotten corridors, met kings who ruled not with swords, but in their own quiet, curious ways. We've listened to their stories, not of battles or conquests, but of fragility, of longing, of lives lived differently in a world that often failed to understand them. And now, as your breath slows and your thoughts grow soft, let yourself return to this moment, wherever you are, whatever brought you here tonight. Let the past settle behind you like dust on an old windowsill. Let the present hold you gently, like a warm blanket pulled just a little tighter. And let the future wait quietly, knowing there will be time for it tomorrow. Because tonight is for rest. For dreams. For the gentle hush of a story well told. If you enjoyed this journey through history, if these quiet tales helped ease your mind and soften the edges of your day, then thank you from the bottom of my heart. You are not alone in seeking peace, and searching for stillness, and wanting to fall asleep wrapped in the warmth of a familiar voice. And I hope you'll return soon, for another evening, another story, another quiet escape into the past. Until then, take care of yourself. Rest deeply. Sleep well. And know that somewhere, in the pages of history, there will always be a place for you to return to. Good night.